pass between Columbus's first voyages and the exploration of the Mexican coastline, and another pass before the Incas fell. Not sure exactly how much a generation is, but I was thinking about it in your lifetimes. It'd be like now versus 1992, right? What were you doing in 1992?
Not existing.
Not existing, yeah. I was existing. I was graduating from college. I was on top or the bottom of the world. So, that'd be kind of like me trying to remember back to that time. Yeah, I think I'm as old as Pizarro was when he came into the Inca Empire, at least according to the movie we watched. So that'll tell you something. I mean, the thing is that, yeah, I mean, people had a lot of experience in the Caribbean, right? Had been doing this thing, going back and forth. Some people had probably even grown up in the Caribbean. There were probably, you know, mixed heritage and descendants. And Columbus, where you remember, wanted to have he was more interested in a kind of, this probably makes sense. He wasn't a Spaniard, right? He was from Genoa. He was a trader and a sailor himself, and he wanted to sail for the Portuguese. So he was not, I mean, he wanted the Spanish to give him things, but he was not really interested in Spanish style or Castilian style conquest. He was basically setting up a trading post in the style of the Portuguese. That was his idea, that you got stuff from the people. And as we saw in the film, Even the Rain or Tambien la Lluvia, he wanted them to give him some gold, get that and trade it back. Whereas, what were they looking for, James, when they now? Like, what's the idea now when they're going into this thing, the mainland? What are they after? Wealthy kingdoms. They probably heard rumors about them, right? They've been exploring around, and people are like, "Oh yeah, those people over there have a lot of stuff." And so, what basically it happens is that they adapt the Spanish model, which the Spanish had tried to do on the Canary Islands, and which was total territorial control and tribute extraction. So you'd try and get people under your control as a territory and get them to pay tribute to you. They introduce us to two words here, the encomiendas. That was what a lot of these conquerors, conquistadores, were looking for, a grant of land and the people who lived on it, and then they'd be you didn't have complete rule over them, but they would be your subjects and they'd labor for you and give you tribute. And congregación, which means to sort of get these, if they weren't as sedentary as, say, the Aztecs and the Inca, to sort of consolidate them into these more sedentary communities. They note here, and this will come up a little bit in those strange parts where they talk about the explorations into the Pacific, that the Spaniards also tried this out on the Philippines. And this is one of those kind of not so known aspects of Latin American colonialism, that the Philippines was pretty crucial to the whole experience, and in some ways echoed a lot of the experience that the Spanish had in Latin America, to the point that they just called them Indios as well. They're like, oh, the Indios of the Philippines. So they kind of lumped these categories together, and then, I mean, even to this day, there's a lot of Spanish loan words in Filipino languages, and there's a lot of Spanish style surnames and things like that. So some people have thought that you really should think of the Philippines together with this experience in Latin America. This chapter is called The Chain of Conquest. I just wanted to think about this, why Restall and Lane call this a chain of conquest, as opposed to what we usually call it is the Spanish conquest. Now, Restall wrote an earlier book, which he says you could read along with this book, called The Seven Myths of the Spanish Conquest, in which he was trying to demolish some of these myths about the Spanish conquest. And here he calls it not the Spanish conquest, but the chain of conquest. Now, if you went home over break to your people and you talked about And we usually have this idea that, when we say the Spanish conquest, we have this idea that there was this, it brings to mind the idea of a Spanish army coming in, conquering people, battles, right? All those things. What would you say about that? What would you say about Spain? You had to, as we remember, there wasn't really a Spain. It was starting to come into being around this time. There was Castile, there was Aragon, they were starting to consolidate and starting to think about themselves as a Spain. But the idea that the Spanish, that Spain even had an army to send over, if they, yeah, they probably would have kept it for the for defense against their French neighbors or somebody else if they even had an army. They weren't there. Remember, even then, there was kind of this chain of conquest within the Iberian Peninsula. And as Restall and Lane point out, the people that were in the Americas were not soldiers in any sense of the word. They did not consider themselves fighting for an army. They did not have formal military training. The training that they had, they got from like doing whatever they were doing in the Americas. So they were not soldiers. You might remember that military historian in the film. He's like, yeah, they were ruthless, but they were not soldiers in the modern sense, and they were not soldiers even in comparison to people who might have been in various armies in Europe. These people were not soldiers. Ryan, what else were they not that we sometimes think about them as when we think the Spanish conquistadores? Yeah, so we think of them sometimes as they were not the highest class. The highest class was secure in their position in Spain. They were fine over there. They didn't want to come over here. So these were not nobility. Both or I mean, Restall called and Lane called them armed entrepreneurs. So basically, they were this middle class of people. They were trying to work their way up. They weren't the poorest because you had to have some resources to get into this. So a lot of them were artisans. They made things, or, some of them, they had varying levels of education, but they were trying to get ahead in the world. And they acquired some, they obviously had to fight and acquired some military training, and some of them probably had some formal training. But I think the best way to describe them is armed entrepreneurs. And the reason they talk about this as chain of conquest is it was a kind of relay system where it's like, okay, you're going to get the approval from the king, who's going to then give you additional approval, and you kind of keep this cycle going down the chain of command or the chain of conquest. Yeah. But, or I mean, they do tell the story somewhat. We'll get to that on pages 94 and 95, about how, I mean, what the governor had. Well, Liam, what did the governor have of Cuba, that Velasquez guy? What did he give, or what was he given?
Official license to conquest.
The official license to conquest, or the license to invade. So he had this license, right? And the thing was, is Cortés, yeah, he doesn't trust Cortés, and he's eventually tries to stop him, or then he wants him to go, then he tries to stop him. And the problem is everybody knew that if you were in this chain of conquest, you could try and like go over the heads. And so that's what the governor of Cuba thought, is like, this Cortés guy is going to go around my back, which sure enough he did. What happened, Noah? How long did it take for him to get the official, for Cortés to even get the sanction of the crown here? So he's trying to do this. He's sending his own people off to Spain to get this thing. It takes him 6 years to legitimize this thing. So one of the interesting things about this is that the people who were doing the conquest, how to say, they weren't necessarily as interested in the conquering of people, but what they could get out of it. And the only way you could get something out of it is if you had official sanction, the license from the crown. If you didn't have that, it really wasn't worth it. You wouldn't get the stuff that you needed. And so I was thinking about this, they call this the chain of conquest, and I think that's a better way to think about it. then maybe the Spanish conquest, because like I said, Spain's just kind of coming into being. It isn't an army. These aren't like nobles or anything like that. But I think Chain of Conquest is almost too tidy. I'm going to call it a very messy conquest because this thing is crazy. I learned so much about, how nuts this all was. So there's first the Aztec part. Well, they first say that this chain system, the chain of conquest, they say was not a stable system, but rather one that bred competition and betrayal. See, that sounds pretty messy to me. No, you called it the complexities of conquest, but I think complexity is too long of a word. It's got too many syllables. I just think it was a mess. Yeah, James.
How did anyone get anything done?
How did anything get anything done? Yeah, I started to wonder that too, because he got that Cuban governor, right? And he's like, get out of here. No, don't. And so then he tries to stop him, but then he goes. And in fact, they didn't get anything done because it turns out he says this, right? Upon reaching the Mexican mainland, Cortés's 500 men squabbled for months over where to go, what to do next, and how to ensure they could keep whatever spoils they gained. So in fact, for months, it's true, for much longer than this class, they just fought about what they were going to do. They didn't get anything done. So, it took a while to even get anything done. Yeah.
Because they weren't actual professional soldiers, how did they just not immediately just run away the second they saw an army? I mean,
Well,
there was only 500
right.
of them.
Well, you have to remember they weren't confronted by armies as well. And the thing is, if they were confronted by an army, let's say the Aztecs, then they got together. Then they got their shit together. I mean, they did have enough. Remember, they had experience. They did have military experience. And so they were able to figure this one out. But really, well, actually, James, what do they want to do first? What's the best way to get something done if you have an army coming after you, or you want to go conquer somebody with an army?
Rip nothing down your own skin.
Ah, it's later on. No, first you got to get some buddies with
Yeah,
you.
this is when you use the common enemy, right?
Right. So first you got to get some people on your side that are already have been fighting these guys and know what to do.
How do you like?
About a little bit of a convenience. Nobody trusts anybody. Let's put it that way. The Spanish don't trust their allies, and the allies don't trust the Spanish. Nobody's trusting anybody because they actually, well, how do they even know what's going on? Actually, Pluto, how do they know what's going on? How do they even know who to talk to and who to trust and what to tell people? Well, they do, but you have to know the language in order to lie. Who do they lie through? Yeah, they get an interpreter. They get Malinche is given to Cortés as like basically, hey, take this person, a few more of our girls too. And the Malinche turns out to be very good at learning languages, and so she can translate between all these things and try and do this. So then they go in and they're actually guests. So for 6 months, they just live with the Aztec emperor and they're just chilling out. I guess they trusted each other then. Or Liam, they don't trust each other. Why?
I can't remember the right word. The Spanish were terrified. They were alone on different
Right.
communication. They got off from everything. So they were just like, you're not gonna kill me.
They had no Wi-Fi for 6 months. They're just sitting in the middle of a lake, in the middle of a temple, and they don't have any access to anything. They get really scared, right? I mean, nobody trusts anybody. Nobody's, this is like, and then Cortés has to do what? He's heard that somebody's come in to go get him. So Cortés has to go off and fight with the people who had been sent from the Cuban governor. Like they didn't even trust each other, right? So, there's a bunch of people coming in to capture Cortés because he's out of line. He was supposed to just explore. He's not supposed to be conquering. And so Velasquez sent over his people, and I guess Cortés beat them or convinced them to come with him, most of them. Anyway, then they just kill Moctezuma because they're getting all scared, and then they blame it on their own people. Then they almost get killed. I mean, half of them do get killed. They all have to sneak out. They try to sneak out, and then half of them got killed. They call it what? They call it the sad night. They killed more the La Noche Triste, the tragic night. They killed more than half the Spaniards and thousands of Tlaxcalan and their other native allies. Things are not looking good for Cortés. He's got, most of his guys are dead. And so it actually took them a year. They had to wait a year, then they convinced some more people to come over to their side, and then they were able to shoot cannons in. By that time, there were probably some diseases running around at the time, so things were better. Yeah, I mean, we will get to the question of how did they even survive? How did they even get anything done? So that's the Aztec side. It was pretty messy. I mean, they needed that last ally. If that wouldn't have happened, they probably wouldn't have done it. The Inca side, huh? We saw a little bit of this, but actually I didn't know about all these guys. Pizarro was not just himself, he was these four brothers. It was like four brothers of Pizarro. And they're like, yeah, we want to be like you, Cortés. We want to do that. But then it says, this was, I don't know, I don't want to say funny, but it's like he's sailing down the coast. He had a decade of coastal reconnaissance and humiliating failure. There you go, James. How would you like to have a decade of humiliating failure? That's a long time to be failing, right? I mean, you know, a lot of these people didn't even make it. Pizarro got lucky, right? Probably a lot of people died. So first he's going down there. Then you go, yeah, you acquire some more people to translate for you into Quechua. So during this time, at least you're learning the language, or at least getting some people who can. Then you got to make sure that Diego de Almagro is not part of this thing, because he was with you and he was going to come, but then you're like, cut him off. He'll come up later. He gets kind of mad, passes it down to his son. Then you finally, remember the Inca in a civil war, and Atahualpa's won a little bit, so he's celebrating a victory, and he's like, hey, come party with me. And they're like, sure, but now we're going to capture you. So then they capture Atahualpa, and they're like, okay, you want him back? Just like in the movie, you're going to have to give us lots of gold and lots of silver.
You just killed him anyways.
And they just kill him anyway. Yeah, so just kill him. Right, there we go. Then you have the Inca Rebellion. Now, we saw this in the movie, and they concentrate mostly on Lima here for obvious reasons, but actually the siege of Cusco was even larger, and they almost did it. They almost got it. So the Inca almost, or what was the reborn Inca, we might say, almost again drove them all out. The Inca actually did retreat, but the Inca actually retreated to that place. It was kind of interesting. They went up to a place beyond Machu Picchu, and they just kind of lived there with their own line of emperors until 1572. So I guess you could say that they lost, but they also probably were like, yeah, we're just gonna relax here and be an Inca. If you can be an emperor of something, I guess I might take that over trying to fight these guys. So anyway, yeah, this was pretty messy stuff. It was, it was a chain of conquest, but it was a mess. Yeah.
I can kind of understand it.
There's a couple of weird parts to there's one long weird section to this chapter which talks about the voyages into the Pacific. I was glad none of you even really talked about this, because I don't know much about this. It was kind of, I guess the point of this is, one, to sort of give us the scope of conquest, and then a lot of these voyages were just terrible failures too. Talk about a mess. But I learned some stuff about this one, this little route between, so basically remember they were always trying to get to Asia, and they finally did. They sailed from Acapulco, and then they'd sail around here, and then they hit the Philippines, where we talked about the Philippines, and that came under Spanish rule, and they'd use that as a base for other ventures. Along the way, it's a long trip. Along the way, they found, though, that Guam was a good stopping point, and it became a pretty crucial. You can't see it very well on this map because it's a small island. It's actually pretty important to another country right now.
It's an American territory.
Yeah, it is. It's a huge military base and has been important for quite a while. For those, Liam, you're with me in cultural ecology. Remember those brown snakes?
Yes.
Yeah, it's a pretty sad story, Guam, right? Yeah. It was the largest per capita population of brown tree snakes that eliminated the native birds and other things and basically get spread around to different islands because of the military. Yeah, it's kind of it's a pretty sad story in both Spanish and American colonialism. But yeah, we owned Guam. We owned the Philippines for a while too, because we got it from the Spanish during that little war. Anyway, they needed a way back. Apparently that was pretty hard too. But this guy, Urdaneta, discovered that if you went up here, then you could get these favorable currents and winds and come back around basically the 40th parallel and then sail down here. Apparently, according to Restall and Lane, people would start making, this became like they started sailing these routes for a couple hundred years. And one of the big questions is, why did they never find Hawaii? Right? They just kept sailing around and around. It seems like that would have been a great stopping point. Get some lovely beaches, great people. Why didn't the Spanish land there? Apparently what happened is once they found this route and the return route, they did try to go a little bit further south, like a few degrees latitude south, but because it was cold up here, but it was too dangerous. It was too hard. The currents weren't in your favor and it was too long of a stretch. And so a lot of people died. So people just didn't, once Urdaneta found this route back, they just didn't come into this place. It was going to be too far south. They found a reliable route back basically into Acapulco. And that's what they kept doing without ever colonizing Hawaii. Leave that up to other people. Then they have this long talk about the Solomon Islands and this person all these people who went off. What were they looking for, Liam? What did they think they'd find out there?
Material wealth. Drugs.
Drugs. Drugs too. Yeah, drugs. Despite their dreams, the Spanish discovered no spices, drugs, or mineral wealth to match the legend of Ophir. Yeah, I mean, this was a kind of a crazy part of this, and it says that they say the fabled, let's see, they said that they always thought that they were gonna find these golden empires. And they never found them, but there were always this idea. Oh yeah, this is on page 106. Since Pizaro's day, there had been rumors of treasure islands somewhere out there, despite Magellan having missed them. So they kept thinking there's got to be some great islands out there.
El Dorado, like the one movie. Yep.
Yeah, but I mean, it was either going to be in the Amazon. Some people were going east into the Amazon, keeping to look for, they kept looking for big gold cities, but these people that sailed out here, yeah.
I remember reading somewhere that a lot of different cultures they encountered would basically lie to them about like an El Dorado existing so they would move on and not take them over.
Another tactic, yeah. We don't have gold, but over there, they have a lot of gold. Right. It says such claims may seem preposterous today. They do. But who, after all, had expected the gold and silver rich Aztec and Inca empire? So on the one hand, they're like, on the one hand, we from our vantage point can say you guys were crazy. On the other hand, they found the Inca and the Aztecs, so this seemed like a good idea. The drugs. Yeah, they threw that in there. No spices.
So throwaway. I
Yeah.
haven't seen anything else in the book about
I hadn't seen the drugs. Yeah, no. I forgot about the drugs. They were probably on drugs when they got out there, yeah. I mean, something, yeah, yeah. Well, I mean, by this time, they probably were chewing a lot of coca, man, which is not a very powerful drug. Coca in its leaf form is not very, it's more like drinking coffee, but, you know, yeah, if you chew enough of it, you can probably get crazy. Anyway, yes, what kept them alive? So, you know, what kept the conquistadores going? How'd they get anything done? So they mentioned a few factors. One was disease that was more affecting the indigenous populations than the Spanish conquistadores. So, you know, indigenous populations just had to wrestle with more of this. And Restall and Lane says sometimes this happened before the Europeans even got there, they'd be decimated by disease. And of course, as we talked about, having native allies who were on your side and, you know, at least for the time, didn't necessarily trust each other, but were useful at the time. And the weaponry, especially having steel weapons. So we saw this in the film. It's like you can hack your way through when you're using steel weapons, and they were good at that. Now, Restall and Lane say that, you know, we get really excited about guns, but their guns were not that great. They were usually.
They would have been on like Matchlock at this point, right?
Yeah, I mean, they weren't that great. They weren't that great in the tropics. The gunpowder was always getting spoiled.
They'd be pretty terrifying.
Yeah, I mean, yeah.
Things like that.
No, it was, I mean,
Demoralizing.
yeah, it was a factor. It just wasn't a huge factor. And people make a lot of deal about horses, which was important too, or the dogs. We've seen dogs. I mean, all these things were probably scary and terrifying, but the indigenous people adopted pretty quickly to those. The steel and the weaponry was not so important. And then, James, you're right. Now it's time for the fourth reason, which is it's an odd thing because this war, this conquest was being fought in the Americas. You would expect the people in the Americas to have the advantage, right? Because they know the terrain, they know what's going on. They have, you know, they're fighting for their own land, right? And in fact, well, James, what are they risking here?
The Spanish?
Yeah.
Nothing more than their own lives.
Well, that sounds like a lot. Nothing beyond their own skins. I don't want to risk my life. But what was their attitude going in?
If they don't, they're gonna like kind of become outcasted, or they'll be in debt, or they won't have a life either way.
Right. So remember, these guys they're not the poorest people. They're in the middle. They're trying to get ahead. They have people back home. So if they win, they're in good shape, right? They've made it. If they lose, they have to go back and say that they were failures. And they don't really have anything else at stake there. Like they don't have a family. Whereas the indigenous people had to think about, hey, you know, what's my family gonna do? I have my house here. So the indigenous people are actually more akin to Josie asked, why didn't they rebel more? I mean, because in some ways they're like, wait a second, I have to take care, you know, they're more actually inclined to seek accommodation because they want to preserve their whatever they have. They don't necessarily see it as a completely like life or death matter, or it is in the sense that you're going to lose everything. Whereas by kind of either encouraging them to move along or accommodating yourself, you live to fight another day.
Ally with Spanish.
Right.
Privileges.
Yeah, or you know, be able to rise up yourself in the hierarchy, right? So, you know, a number of the people, I think they're going to talk about this, a number of the people who were indigenous then become sort of part of the conquest armies themselves, right? They go off and get to conquer other people. It made me also wonder though about these, you know, Cortés, the Pizaro Brothers, you know, did they win this thing? I mean, I guess maybe it's better to be them than to be like Atahualpa or Moctezuma, but well, what happens to Cortés, Noah? What is he win this whole thing? What's his last gasp? What does he want? I think he doesn't get what he wants, right? He goes back to the king, and the king's gonna give him something. He was bought off with an illustrious new title and given enormous. Yeah, he wanted to be even bigger than that. He didn't get it. And then he goes into a failed expedition in North Africa. Cortés died in Seville. So he goes back. I mean, he did get a lot, but he didn't get what he wanted. And then he just dies in Seville, which is in Spain. Then these other guys. So Francisco Pizarro gets assassinated in Lima. Remember that guy that he cut out of the deal? Well, his son got pissed off and like goes to assassinate him. Apparently it worked. So that's the end of him. I don't want to get assassinated by somebody's son. That sucks. And then that guy and Gonzalo Pizarro get executed. So that's no fun. And then there's Juan Pizarro, who's I don't know which order these brothers are, you know, we'll leave that, but he dies in the siege of Cusco. So he dies too. So there's one person who survives to go back to Spain who dies as a wealthy but bitter old man back in Spain. Actually, I think that's what I want to be, a wealthy but bitter old. Or is it better to be, what do you think is better? To be a happy old man but poor? Huh?
Having money.
Having money? You'd rather be a wealthy but bitter is fun. All right, so he did win.
Health insurance is expensive.
16th century health insurance.
Right.
Yeah. What do they have to worry about? They pay taxes, but they have to pay for health insurance.
Yeah, I don't know.
So what was Cortés doing in Africa?
You know, this is my first reading of it. After participating in a failed expedition in North Africa. Remember the Spanish and the Portuguese were trying to, they were trying to make.
We tried doing the same thing like Morocco or something?
Yeah, no, I mean, remember they've been trying to colonize this place. We talked about this sustained invasion of the Portuguese and the Spanish. So they were trying, just didn't work all the time. Oh, right. And then the conquistadores in Peru, right? The king sent them a letter that says, you can't enslave the Native Americans. You're like, you basically, you're gonna, they basically clamp down on the conquistadores. And it says here, conquistador resentment of what were known as the new laws sparked a conquistador revolt and civil war in Peru that lasted until 1548. So they're the ones that are like rebelling against the Spanish crown. They're like, no, you can't do this. Yeah. So then that's when a lot of them get killed and die and all those things. So I don't know. I'm not sure this is winning. I mean, yes, eventually we have Spanish control. We'll talk about this, but not sure I wanted to be one of these guys. In Restall's book of the 7 myths, he also talks about the myth of the white conquistador. We've talked about that a little bit in terms of the native allies who were also, in their own sense, some of them conquistadors. But it's important to realize here that Africans were part of every voyage and every expedition into the mainland. They're depicted in indigenous art about the conquest. And many of them, of course, were enslaved, but some of them were able to either play a more important role. Some of them were even became known as kind of black conquerors. So they give us the example of Sebastian Toral, who's able to get his freedom. He's getting taxed, and then he sails across to Madrid, and he tries to get the tax revoked. I think he does. In the little box called the Black Conquistadors, Restall and Lane mentioned Juan Garrido, who was basically became a kind of a leader here. Now, Pluto and probably others want to know more about these people. Unfortunately, we don't know a ton. It's a good historical project, but there's not a lot of documentation on them. But it's important to realize that that was a huge part of the conquest. There's also the issue of gender. We talked about, oh, wait, yeah, I was interested in the film. We saw something from Maria Rostworowski, lived to be 100 years old, famous historian and from Peru, but she was talking about, I mean, we've talked about a little bit about Malinche, and she was talking about this other person. I don't know if I just misunderstood the pronunciation of her name. She's apparently had a couple different names when she was baptized and before she was baptized, but she became Pizaro's, I don't know, I guess they say concubine in the movie. I'm not sure what the terms are that we should use. Well, let me pass you out something. So this is, I'm gonna give you this. This is page 170 and 171 on the back of the afterword of Restall's 7 Myths of the Spanish Conquest, which is to say it's something he wrote in 2021 when they were republishing the book. And he's basically saying, these are the things that I should have paid more attention to. Well, maybe I take them. So one of the things he says he should have paid more attention to was the gendered aspect of the conquest. And he says that, you know, there were that the problem is that many historians have talked about concubines and lovers and these kinds of things and use these kinds of euphemisms for what were basically teenage sex slaves. And they were, you know, and that was this trade in women, which are young girls, was, you know, I mean, we basically gloss it over with these euphemisms, but this is a huge issue. So in Restall's afterword, the first thing he talks about here, I mean, I've excerpted from this book on page 170. He says that, you know, we should have paid more attention to how much enslaving was being done in the Americas, especially of teenage girls and women. And so then in here, he says the indigenous noblemen, this is right in the middle of that paragraph, were also complicit in the trade. After all, Malintzin or Malinche was not seized, but, quote, given by local ruling men to invading conquistadors along with 19 other teenage girls. So that was probably part of the strategy of getting people to move along, right, was to give these guys I mean, that's a terrible word, but that's what was done, right? And so what he's saying, while men were also enslaved, the topic lends itself more usefully to the gendered nature of conquest culture and of the European invasion of the Americas. So this is something that we, you know, is important and we shouldn't overlook. Then he talks about this whole notion of native allies. And this goes back to a question, James, that you raised about who's trusting who, why trust him. And he says that we should even go further, that in fact, the whole idea that they were allies of the Spanish puts the Spanish in charge of this. When at least some of these people, some of the indigenous leaders must have been like, aha, how convenient. We now have these guys who will go help us out fighting the Aztecs or fighting the Inca, and they got some cool stuff too. They got these cool swords, and we can use them to our advantage here. So he says that we should sometimes see that indigenous Spanish alliances were often forged by local rulers whose motivations remained hidden or poorly grasped by Spanish captains. So, you know, they might have had their own ideas for how to do this. And then he says that's what he should have led with. He says that he would think about disease, but in a slightly different way. If you look over to the back of the page on page 171, he says, yeah, disease was huge, but it happened over the next couple centuries. During the wars, disease affected indigenous communities allied with Spaniards as much as, arguably more than, those who resisted the invaders. So remember, we've been saying that disease was a factor in the conquest, right? But as he says here, disease would have affected more the people that you were closest to rather than the people you were fighting. And he says, you know, that everybody's projecting this back. And so then he makes the curious statement. Remember when he talked about Bartolomé de las Casas and says Las Casas didn't understand disease? Here he says, it begins to look as if Bartolomé de las Casas, who attributed demographic catastrophe in the Caribbean to conquistador atrocities rather than disease, may have had a point. That maybe we've been overemphasizing disease and underemphasizing the impact of violence and slavery, as well as the centrality of indigenous Spanish alliances. So this is an interesting kind of reframing. Again, he's not saying that disease was not a factor, but that, you know, we still have to look at this more in the context of the brutality and the indigenous alliances which were being forged there. And then he says that steel, he overstated the advantage of steel swords, that they have to be held in the context of an array of technological advantages, from armor to navigational tools, technical maps, and ocean-going ships. And then this very last sentence I wanted to again emphasize. Surely there was a hemispheric class between various indigenous cultures of war and a European one that was gradually developing ideologies of racism while moving slowly towards the application and acceptance of total warfare. So again, we talked about how the conquistadores were not soldiers. This was not an army, but this whole idea that of subduing an entire population, of that a whole group of people should be grouped under this idea of race, and that a total warfare was justified. That is something they were slowly moving towards during this time. So, you know, like I said, I think you can look over, this is sort of, I think this kind of goes with not just his book, but with this chapter in the book as well, because it's kind of a reconsideration of some of the points that he made here from a later date. Now, finally, I think what's good to sort of go back to and tackle some of the so what questions. Why do we care about the Spanish conquest, the conquest of the Americas? As we saw in the film and in this book, this is a pretty world-changing event. And the way we think about what happened in the Americas has a lot to do with the way we think about the whole period of Western expansion from, say, 1500, I don't know, maybe 2000 is too late, maybe it's too early, but you know, it's a whole kind of template for that. And the question is, you know, who are the people who are able to make this history? Who makes it happen? And so there's lots of assumptions about this, that there was, you know, I think Ryan, you brought this up, the idea that, oh, it was just because the Spanish were superior, they just marched in, especially because of all their technology and weaponry. And on the other side, there's the assumption that the people who don't have that stuff, either they don't have culture at all, or there are just a bunch of evil savages that we can group under the name Indians or Indios, or on the contrary, they might be considered to be, oh, they're living at peace with their land and all noble. And so we have these ideas of superiority and also as inferiority, that there's a destiny of these other people, like the indigenous peoples, that they're going to just disappear, either because they're too bad, they're not doing things, or maybe because they're too good, they're too noble. Again, this leads us to the question of, well, how do we treat other humans? What is the role of people in the world? How should we be nice to each other? What we find from this history is that the people who were often ignored in all of this, the indigenous allies who were ignored, forgotten, were actually probably crucial to, extremely important in how our story takes place. And in ways that we, again, as Restall points out, we don't understand, because we've always been framing it from the viewpoint of conquistadores in their chronicles. And so it might be, in fact, that there were at least some indigenous people who were using the Spanish as much as the other way around. I think we get a sense for this that it's a lot more complicated, a lot more messy than it's often been depicted. And so it wasn't necessarily all going to be inevitable. There was a lot of things that could have gone the other way. There were a number of battles and sieges, and a lot of them did. A lot of places were basically not subjugated for decades or even centuries. So if this is our past, if this is this real story of this crucial development in world history, then as good historians and anthropologists, we know then that our future is not inevitable. Certain people aren't destined to disappear or destined to conquer. And it's a good idea that we pay attention to all the messiness and complexity and diversity of people who have both in people who are traditionally ignored or discarded or said to not be powerful in the world.